And I assume everybody can see my screen now.
I can see that.
Okay, awesome. So today it's my pleasure to be here, and thank you everybody again for being here. Thank you, Dr. Tara, for the invitation and everybody who made this seminar possible. Today, I will be talking about the use of numerical models in Earth system research with examples on climate change and extreme precipitation. Before I continue further, I would like to acknowledge my PhD advisor, Dr. Christopher Bretherton, and his collaborators and my mentors, Dr. Murat Kurudinov and Dr. Peter Blasi. The work that I will show that, some of the work are going to be from other scientists, and I cite them at the bottom of the slides, but a lot of the work that will be shown later would have not been accomplished if I didn't have the help and the guidance from these three scientists. So when we talk about climate change, a few thoughts might have come up to our mind, like the sea ice breaking, sea level rises, tropical cyclones or typhoons hitting our countries or other regions of the world. When people talk about climate change, I hear a lot talking about the increase in global temperature and forest fire. However, flood and other extreme precipitation, extreme weather becomes a problem. The lower right of this screen, you see a picture of the crops and dry land. The US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration put it on their website about climate change that in the future, even French fries on a table might be a problem or might not be, like you can't take it for granted, because food security is for sure gonna be a problem if climate change is not mitigated. But is the concept of climate change new? I would say no, because based on last year, the three physics Nobel laureates received their prize. Well, two of them received their prize because of their work on climate change, and the other one on chaos in the Earth system model. So there were three Nobel laureates in physics: Klaus Hasselmann, Giorgio Parisi, and Syukuro Manabe. Today for my talk, I will be focusing on Syukuro Manabe, or Suki Manabe for short. How his work has pioneered the study in atmospheric science and how we're still using the concept of his modeling in our work nowadays. So let me read you a few paragraphs from an article from the Conversation in October 2021. After the Second World War, many of Japan's smartest scientists found jobs in North American laboratories. Suki Manabe, a 27-year-old physicist, was part of this brain drain. He was working on weather forecasting, but left Japan in 1958 to join a research project by the US Weather Service to develop a numerical model that could be used to study the climate. Working alongside Joseph Smagorinsky, the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory visionary first director, Manabe led a team of computer programmers to add missing physics to the lab's weather model. Even the best computers in the world at the time were far less powerful than today's mobile phones. So to get the model to work, Manabe needed to make the physics as simple as possible. This meant making a range of coding approximations to quantify how the air exchanged heat and water vapor with the land, ocean, and ice. So this article from the Conversation was titled "The Most Influential Climate Science Paper of All Time." And today I'm going to show you part of this paper so you can appreciate the classical model before the computers were as fast as our phones. This graph that you see on the left consists of 3 lines. So it came from 3 runs of the model that Manabe and his co-worker used and published in a paper in 1967 in the Journal of Atmospheric Sciences. So these are lines that show the temperature profile of the atmosphere from the surface at the bottom, altitude 0 kilometer, to the top of stratosphere, about 50 kilometer. You see that in the lower 12 kilometer in this figure, the temperature lowers with increasing height. In this area, it's the troposphere, where we have all the weather patterns, all the weather systems happening. And at one point, about 12 12 to 15 kilometers, depending on where you are in the world, actually, the temperature started to increase with height. In that part is called stratosphere. This is a unique structure of the temperature profile in the atmosphere. And what Manabe did was that he showed that with various concentration of carbon dioxide gas, the temperature changes differently in the bottom part, in the lower part of the atmosphere compared to the upper part. So from blue to black to red lines, this is increasing in the carbon dioxide concentration. 300 parts per million was the value of about, I think, a few decades ago at least. Right now we're at 400 parts per million. And he showed that with more carbon dioxide, it's warmer near the surface, colder aloft. What this means is that the change in temperature, the Earth's surface temperature that we observe, is actually not by the radiation, not by the sun being stronger or closer to the Earth, because otherwise the temperature would have changed in the same direction everywhere. And I'll show you the figure that proves that in a little bit too. What you're seeing in this green box is the title of Manabe's original work that was named as the most influential paper in climate science. He was working on a model called radiative convective equilibrium. I'm going to throw the equation out there, but don't worry about it. But basically, this concept of RCE is that there is always a balance between energy gained through radiation, heating from the sun and from the earth, and the loss of heat by convection or the cloud making process. So with the balance in the energy sources, energy transfer, we can compute the profile of the atmosphere being that dark pink, dark red line that you see on the left. So Manabe and his coworker developed this model or radiative convective equilibrium as an initial value problem. And because of the limit in computer power back then, they used this model in one dimension, so basically one line. They computed the atmospheric temperature as a function of solar constant, carbon dioxide level, ozone level, and cloudiness or water vapor. In this picture, well, this figure is right now from that paper that I showed you the title earlier. These different lines are the temperature of the atmosphere with different solar constant. The most right line is when the sun is strongest, and that's when he gets the temperature to be warmer everywhere in the atmosphere. These next two figures that just popped up are the temperature of the atmosphere at various carbon dioxide and ozone concentration. And you see the reverse trend that it being warmer near the surface with more greenhouse gases and colder at the top around 30 or 40 kilometers above the surface. So with the change of greenhouse gases, not only the temperature changes, but also the wind patterns and the amount of rain and a lot of other physical, like we call it the circulation, but basically the airflow in the atmosphere of the entire Earth. Two other subjects that Manabe and his coworker touched on was the change of surface albedo or reflectivity and cloudiness or water vapor and how that affects the temperature. Basically, if there is more reflectivity from the surface, whether it be through brighter surface or more clouds, the temperature of the atmosphere will be lower too. This concept is still being explored nowadays in terms of how we can mitigate the effect of climate change, especially of the rising temperature of our world. So fast forward to 2005, what researchers are still using nowadays, they're still using radiative convective equilibrium in the 21st century. This is only one example. And now 30, 40 climate centers are running RCE simulations and try to compare the results for the climate change case. This is one of the earlier RCE simulations using very fine resolution simulation. And now we can run this in 3 dimensions. So what you're looking at, please focus on the dark black line in these 2 time series. There are time series of water vapor and radiative heating. So as the model reaches equilibrium, think of when you took chemistry class in high school, they would say the system will reach an equilibrium and say concentration of the substances will be constant with time. Here in atmospheric science model, when we plot variables like water vapor or heat, we know that the model reaches equilibrium when the domain mean quantities of these values remain pretty constant with time. What you're seeing on the right here is the snapshot of the model. The left column is from day 20 and the right column is from day 50. The upper row shows a surface precipitation or rain, and the bottom panel shows water vapor in the entire atmosphere. So with RCE simulations, we simplify the model by starting everything without horizontal variations, being that at the very beginning of the model, everything looks the same when you're at the same horizontal plane. And as the model develops, we get clouds popping here and there. Say at day 20, you see the clouds sparsing out throughout the entire domain. And by day 50, the clouds clump together. In atmospheric science, we call this the aggregation of the clouds. These are through the computations equations that go into the model. So with radiative convective equilibrium, by the end of this simulation, they were able to produce a deep convection, or the type of cloud that produces heavy rainfall in, say, in Thailand, like these days, when you get big thunders. That's deep convection. Now, Marat Kurudinov, he ran this simulation and he added rotation to this domain. And then he's able to get a system of tropical cyclones or hurricanes or typhoons. The names change depending on where the storm is developed, which oceans that are formed. Adding one dimension or one more part of the complexity, he's able to develop a different type of clouds that represent the world, what's happening in our atmosphere. To summarize so far, I've shown you that in RCE, radiative convective equilibrium, the climate, especially that in the tropical atmosphere, is maintained by the balance between energy gain through radiation and energy loss through cloud making process. This is a balance, somewhat a simplification in this model. To simplify certain part of the atmosphere, we can focus more on the details of the clouds, for example. Now, nowadays, we have many other types of models that help us to look at different systems of the Earth simultaneously. For example, global climate models now include the spherical geometry of the Earth, being that the models see the Earth as a sphere, no longer as a square, or just one single line. There is topography being the land and the ocean, and there's variation in the latitude and the longitude of the model. In the beginning of the model, everything is not uniform. Let me show you the picture of the cartoon explaining what the global climate model is. So here in the cartoon, you see that global climate model represents not only the atmosphere, but also the land and the ocean. It represents the wind, momentum transfer, heat transfer, water vapor, and cloud making process. But still, the important part that cannot be neglected or omitted is the radiation and heat exchange and radiation from the sun, the effect of greenhouse gases. So to summarize, what are GCMs? They are numerical models that now represent all the major systems of the Earth. And how do we know that these models are accurate? How can we trust them to predict what's going to happen in the future in terms of climate? So scientists have run global climate models for the past decades, and then they test it with the observations. This process is called hindcasting. And now they have been used to confirm as well that the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission leads to warming of the Earth's temperature. What goes into global climate models? So on the left of this slide, you can see a few lines from the model. This is a section from HatGem2, one of the most well-known climate models from the UK Met Office. global climate models are still run in Fortran computer language nowadays. You might think that our field, atmospheric science, is a bit of a dinosaur, but there is an advantage to this because Fortran is pretty fast, and because it's been developed in Fortran for decades and decades, we decide to stick with, most of the climate centers decide to stick with Fortran. Some of the climate centers develop global climate models in Python. So I believe that in the future, we're going to have more other models in different other languages. And for now, I'm going to throw a few names of the equations just for fun. So first of all, we have the first law of thermodynamics, the conservation of the energy in the Earth system, that the energy is only transferred but they're not going to be lost or created. We have this Stefan-Boltzmann law that says the energy emitted by a black body is a function of the temperature, and this is important for the radiation part of the model. We have this Clausius-Clapeyron equation, which shows the relationship between water vapor as a function of the temperature. This is a somewhat approximation already, and this is important for the cloud making process. Another well-known equation, that set of equations that you might have heard of, is Navier-Stokes equations for incompressible fluids in a rotating sphere. So here, these equations help solve for the pressure, temperature, the wind speed, density of the gases. And you might ask, like, how come we use incompressible fluid version of these equations? Because gases are compressible. So in the atmosphere, the gas flows very slowly. And with that, we can assume that it is incompressible so that we can add other complexity into the equation, like rotation, and then we can save the computer power to compute other things like oceans and heat exchange. So what I've shown you so far is only one part of the global climate model, the atmosphere, which I work on, but there's still the codes and the scheme for the ocean. Some models include plants and how they, like the water cycle associated with plants and soil. So we get to have many more systems of the Earth in a model as we develop the models more and more, and our computers get faster. I'll show you the result of the global climate models. So to date, there are 40 state-of-the-art global climate models that are part of a big climate model intercomparison project, or CMIP. And if you're interested, the results of these simulations are freely available to anybody who's interested. So you can Google CMIP 6, for example, to get these results, or CMIP 5. What you're looking at here, the lower left, is a time series of the global temperature average throughout the globe, and it's from 1850 to the end of the century. The black line here is called the historical run of the model. So it's been tested and verified with the observations, and the multiple, like the 5 lines with different colors, these project different climate scenarios in the future. The bottom line being the climate, if we can emit, we reduce carbon dioxide emission, and the top line, like the dark red, that's when we run business as usual and keep dumping carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's when the model projects that by the end of the century, the global temperature will rise by 5 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial era. So that's a lot. What you're seeing at the upper right part of this slide is the spatial variation of temperature change scale with 1 degree warming of the entire world. So at the pole, especially the North Pole, that's when the Earth, the ocean, is feeling the heating the most, and near the tropics, it doesn't feel the heat as much, but still it's not negligible. Like if you look at Thailand, if there is 1 degree warming in the entire world, Thailand's average temperature might increase by 1 degree or close to 1 degree too. And that's only an average temperature. That doesn't say anything about precipitation or extreme event. So the lower right part, is showing change in rainfall. In our field, we have the term, the wet gets wetter and the dry gets drier, meaning that in the areas that already have a lot of rainfall, we're going to keep getting more rain. And the areas that are dry, we might get more drought in the future if climate change problem doesn't get mitigated. For all of these simulations, if you go back to the picture on the left, you see the shades in different colors along with the lines. These show the uncertainty, right? And climate models also have uncertainties. This is because different models with different details in the physics, it gives you the probability of like events of weather. And so there's always the uncertainty, no matter how advanced you run the simulations. It's like chaos system. And a major source of these uncertainties arises from clouds, like the clouds that produce the rain, because they are very important in terms of radiation budget. So I'm showing you pictures of the clouds at two different resolutions. The one on the left look like boxes of clouds. They might be similar to Minecraft game or like the old days when we play computer games and everything is so pixelated. But in the real world, clouds have so much details that we sometimes can't even tell from our own eyes at the Earth's surface. Global climate models so far see the clouds like this, like boxes of clouds. They compute the clouds using a simplification method called parameterization, where they assume a relationship between the humidity, pressure, and temperature and the cloud amount. Because of this simplification, global climate models can afford to include other Earth systems in the model. But because clouds are important, we have another type of cloud model called cloud resolving model that has much finer resolution and can compute or resolve the clouds. You can imagine these models can say if the clouds are rising from the surface and hit a certain height, and if it reaches saturation, then the clouds will form. These models are that detailed, and they also include the microphysics of the clouds. However, they are much more computationally expensive, but the benefit is they help understand a lot of the cloud processes. During my PhD work, I had a privilege to work with cloud resolving model simulations. The type of the model that I worked with is the near global aquaplanet model. Aquaplanet here means that we assume everything in this model has the ocean, like there's no land. This is to simplify the heat exchange between land and the ocean. Near global here means that our simulation doesn't represent the entire globe and doesn't see the globe as a sphere, but we assume that the world is a rectangle where everything that comes out from the eastern edge of the domain goes into the western edge. So there's still realistic circulation of the clouds, of the air, and the clouds can be computed. The colors that you see on this figure indicates the cloud top height, like the cooler colors, blue, these represents deeper clouds where the top is colder, and the orange and yellow colors represent lower clouds. These lower clouds are actually very reflective of the sunlight. In near global aquaplanet model, we have variation in sea surface temperature, or the SST, and this is a unique feature at the time when this model was developed, because most of cloud resolving model before this one, they had homogeneous sea surface temperature. This animation shows the result of the model NG Aqua, and the white part is the clouds. The center, the central band in this domain is the rain, the deep clouds that produce a lot of rain in Singapore, Malaysia, or in the tropics. And the lines, the streaks that exit from these rain band in the center toward the northern and southern hemisphere are part of the air that flows from the tropics to the mid-latitude and becomes part of the weather system in places like America or China or Japan. What I'm trying to show is that NG Aqua, they produce realistic cloud and weather systems on all scales. And that's exciting. For us to run 50 days of the simulations of NG Aqua, Marat had to acquire a lot of computer hours from the supercomputer center in Wyoming. It took 100,000 core hours on a 1,000 processor computer to run 50 days of these simulations. At the moment, we cannot afford to run cloud resolving models for decades and decades, like in global climate models. Marat ran them for on the order of hundreds of days instead of like thousands of days or years. And so here, the time on the upper right is, I believe it's day. Marat actually ran the control simulation, present day climate simulation for 100 days, because that's when we believe the model already reached equilibrium and we can obtain enough output that to average them to look at trends of climate change. So as I mentioned, that we did not run these simulations for decades, but how do we study the effect of climate change using simulations like NG Aqua or these expensive models? So to do that, we run different simulations. Take this as initial value problem, right? And run the first simulation in blue, the present day climate, until it reaches equilibrium, and continue a little bit further to obtain enough statistics. And then run another simulation by changing an initial value in the simulation. Here we increase the sea surface temperature by 4 degrees Celsius, enough so that we get changes in the Earth system, in the atmospheric system, that will be significant and big enough for us to see, to get the stats out. And what we can see from these two simulations after they reach equilibrium is that with increase in sea surface temperature alone, we see changes in the cloud fraction, which you see, that's the y-axis. The cloud fraction changes. In the tropics and subtropics, we might get more clouds that produce more rain, and this is the already wet region of the world. In the mid-latitude, between 30 to 40 degrees north and south, this model projects less cloud fraction with warmer sea surface temperature. And these clouds reflect the sunlight. So if this is true, it means as the sea surface temperature becomes warmer, the clouds that reflect sunlight will disappear. And that is bad for the Earth, because that means the ocean will be a lot warmer. So these effects to date, we're still trying to understand and try to confirm whether this will be true. We do this by running more smaller simulations and try to understand the cloud processes. And that was actually part of my postdoc work that unfortunately I didn't get to show it today. We tested another simulation with quadruple carbon dioxide concentration alone, and we kept the sea surface temperature the same as the present day. And Chiagua said only with the change in carbon dioxide concentration, it doesn't change much of the cloud or the circulation. We could also ran another simulation with changes in both the sea surface temperature and carbon dioxide level. And now the result matches pretty well with the linear combination of the previous two simulations. This is another way of running the simulations and do the tests in order to use more complicated models to help us understand our current and future climates. And we can dig deeper into other cloud systems in the model to understand the cloud processes. I've mentioned extreme precipitation, so I want to show you what NG Aqua suggests about extreme precipitation. The graphs that you're seeing here are the distributions of the rainfall at the surface in the tropics and the subtropics. The top row is for the tropics, so let's focus there. I show the 90th, 99th, and 99.9th percentile of the precipitation amount. That's called the extreme precipitation. And when we look at that range only, NG Aqua predicts a 7% increase of extreme precipitation per 1 degree of warming of the Earth. This number scales with the theoretical value, Clausius-Clapeyron equation, but the global climate models tend to predict a lower value. And what does this mean? Well, first, it means it's good to see that simulations that can compute or resolve the clouds get the number consistent with the theory that is based on one line of equation. And why are GCMs giving a lower value? That could be because of different reasons, including that GCMs do not see the clouds as detailed clouds, but they see the clouds as boxes, and parameterization might affect this. So far, the NG aqua that I showed you was one part of the year. It gives realistic clouds, but it still doesn't form tropical cyclones or hurricanes or typhoons, which is another source of extreme precipitation. So in another set of the model, Marat shifted the sea surface temperature distribution in the model so that the maximum is no longer at the equator, but at 15 degrees north. This resembles the Pacific Ocean in September. And that's when tropical cyclones or typhoons and hurricanes start to form. And if you remember, the news about hurricanes and typhoons come around that time. So in a few months for us, what you're looking here is a snapshot showing the water vapor in the model. The darker blue means it has a lot more water vapor in the atmosphere. At the center, you see like the very dark blue spot. That's the tropical cyclone, and that's the eye of the storm. NG Aqua produces very detailed result of the atmosphere of the tropical cyclone, but it also shows the large scale contributions of the dynamics. So it allows us to study tropical cyclones as a multi-scale process. To fast forward, we ran 3 simulations of a world with tropical cyclone, ocean only, and I'm focusing only on the tropics. These 3 simulations, they are only different in the moisture in the very beginning. The difference is as a white noise only at 3 kilometers. So think of it as like an error that is intentional because we want to study the chaos of the system. And we want to know, we asked 2 questions. First, how far is tropical cyclone predictable? Like when will these models diverge? And the second question is what processes contribute to the formation of the tropical cyclones? So I started the animation and you see that in the beginning, everything looks the same or almost the same from our eyes. After about day 5 or 6, now in the box, in the blue box, you see tropical cyclones start to form. Like these lines in green color is the area with strong rotation of the air. You start to see tropical cyclones getting bigger and the new ones form after the previous one moves to the pole. After day 10, these simulations start to diverge. And now you do not see any similarities between these 3 models at all. So that answers our first question, that the tropical cyclone formation is predictable up to about 10 days. That's consistent with weather forecasts, like how far can we trust weather forecasts. And after 10 days, or actually, to me, I'd say 7 days, but after 7 or 10 days, we take weather forecast as probability or statistics rather than like actual events. Now, with tropical cyclone formation, we also found that it depends not only on the wind field, which depends on the large scale dynamics, but it also depends on the available moisture, which is a more random and small scale process, like the cloud making process is small. And so if there is rotation of the air, but there is not enough moisture, tropical cyclones would not form. That's something that we were able to test with this model as we trace each vortex or each cyclone and understand the budget of the moisture and the wind in along these tracks. You might ask, how will tropical cyclones change with climate change? Before I show you the current research, I wanted to point out that Manabe and his co-workers also asked this question using their climate model. This paper published in 1990 titled, Can Existing Climate Models Be Used to Study Anthropogenic Changes in Tropical Cyclone Climate? And the answer is yes, and we're doing this today too. The picture you see on the right is published in the IPCC report. It talks about like how climate change will affect us as humanity. It shows a tropical cyclone projections in terms of frequency and intensity with 2 degrees global warming. What it is showing in terms of frequency is that the models think that tropical cyclones will be less frequent, but there's a large error bar, as you can see. In terms of intensity, there will be more rain and more intense tropical cyclones in a warmer climate. And the reason is consistent with the process that I mentioned earlier, which is that if there is heating or warming of the surface temperature, there is more evaporation from the ocean. That means there's more available moisture. The available moisture acts as an energy source for the tropical cyclones. So the tropical cyclones can become more intense. And this is just one part of the story. Scientists also ask, how will the tracks of the tropical cyclones change? Will they fly more toward the west or toward the north or the south? Like, that's another question that many people are still trying to answer using different types of models. All right, this is my last slide. And to conclude, I've talked about the work of the Nobel laureates in physics from last year, particularly Syukuro Manabe, who used radiative convective equilibrium model to understand the climate change and the effect of greenhouse gases on the Earth's temperature. All three of them laid phenomenal foundation for the development of models that help us understand the Earth's climate system. Back in those days when they started working, computers were not as powerful as today, so they had to rely on more simple classical models. For example, Syukuro Manabe used one-dimensional model, and his coworkers and Suki himself could confirm that the increase of carbon dioxide level is responsible for the warming of the Earth's surface. And nowadays, we have more powerful computers, so we can afford to run high-resolution three-dimensional models. We gain further understanding of the climate and the atmospheric systems. Two types of the model that I mentioned, I gave as examples, were global climate models that include multiple Earth systems, but they still show large uncertainty in climate and temperature changes, and that's because they could not resolve clouds. So there's another type of model called cloud resolving model that uses higher resolution and focuses on computing individual clouds. But because of the complexity that goes into the cloud formation, cloud resolving model has to omit different, some other systems of the Earth. Today, there's several climate centers and scientists who develop global cloud resolving model with full land, full ocean, and the cloud being resolved. They have not run it as like multiple decades yet, again, because of the limited computing resource. But I believe that in the future, as our computers get faster, we will be able to use more complicated simulations to understand our world better. And yeah, that's my last point, that advances in Earth system modeling become a stepping stone for us for a bigger vision in climate science community. And that's to have more computationally efficient and accurate models for weather and climate, and that the results can be shared to everybody so everyone can understand how the world functions.